Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to give a talk today. It's been great to come to this workshop. It's not a community I've had a lot of interaction with, and it's a community I think within the DOE. I come from Los Alamos National Lab. That there's limited interaction, so it's very helpful for me to engage, and hopefully, sort of the second half of my talk, I'm kind of giving two parts of the talk. One is focused on our research that we have been focused on linking land to ocean, and then the second half is kind of an update on what we're working at DOE and what some of the Arctic issues, efforts that we've been working on at the DOE. And so to start with, for linking land to ocean in the Arctic, I put up these two schematics, not because there's a particular thing that I wanted to pull out, but just because the vast array of aspects that you can pull in. And if you're talking about either linking land to ocean or modeling gaps, depending on what you're looking to address or what you want, you could probably pick out almost any component of these and say that there's a gap or something more needs to be done. The Arctic is very dynamic in terms of the fact that not only do you have a lot of change happening on land, but you have sea ice and you have dramatic changes there. And so it presents a range of interactions, and particularly the physical and the biological, I think, are very tightly linked. There's very strong connections between the physical changes in the system and how the biology might change. And so up here, I'm giving sort of two nice overviews of looking at the coasts that come out of the Wild Reach document from a decade ago. And I wanted to highlight that sort of their projection was this is the current state and this is where we might go for the future. And yet, right now, if we want to make predictive understanding or figure out where the Arctic might be going, particularly coastal zone, one of the key limitations is you can pick almost anything in this upper part and we still have a lot of knowledge gaps, and we're still just trying to understand how the system operates. My background is really in geomorphology and hydrology, and it becomes a truly fascinating issue that you take a landscape and you add a thermal component to it. And the question becomes, is it fundamentally different, or is it just slightly different from what we know from systems where you don't have ice and permafrost? And that's been a key question I've been trying to address while I've been at Los Alamos for about the past decade or so. And that's where I'm going to talk about some of our research today. This is an old figure and there's much more updated, but I like it because it's simplicity of just trying to take a look at the carbon cycle and trying to understand what gets the ocean upstream of it. And so looking at the two areas that I'll talk about today, that in the past 5 years through a DOE early career project, we've really been trying to look at the exchange between rivers and floodplains. And so you have an outflow, so deposition there. This is on the Koyukuk River in Alaska. We spent some time there in the summer. It's a major tributary to the Yukon. And this is permafrost. You have a really thick organic layer on top. You have frozen material below it. And then you have deposition on a point bar. And so our central question, which we've really focused on the Arctic, but is a global question, is how does the back and forth, and these arrows really should be two-way, as you go downstream, affect what comes out the end part? And Tom's talk today gave some really nice background examples of what that means for the carbon going into the system. How old is this carbon? What is its state? How does it get mixed? What percentage of this carbon actually makes it to the ocean versus getting deposited right there? What is consumed and evolved to the atmosphere? And then another component that I've been working with a number of researchers at Los Alamos is what happens right in here on the deltas, because most of our data for the rivers comes from upstream of the deltas, and then we may or may not have data offshore. But how much it gets transformed within the delta is a big question, and one that we've been trying to get at. And so to walk through that, I think Maria gave a really great introduction to the Arctic yesterday. Other talks, Lee's talk, have highlighted why we really focus on the Arctic, and so I won't belabor it. You have permafrost, you have the river discharges. From a geomorphic standpoint, why it's particularly interesting, or in the hydrology, is these are sort of critical aspects that I would argue make the Arctic somewhat unique. And the question is how unique and in what ways, which is permafrost. Here's a picture along the Yukon River of an ice wedge in the bank, the frozen material. This is the silic slump. I was working with researchers there trying to understand what the impact of that sediment is on the fishery going into it and how that was going out. But another unique aspect is really the high seasonality of the rivers in the Arctic. That you have, on the blue are 3 Arctic rivers, the green are temperate rivers, or tropical, Amazon, the Congo, and the Mississippi, and you can see how seasonal. It goes almost to zero during the ice over season, and then you have these extremely high peaks. The maximum to mean ratio of Arctic rivers range from about 3 to 6 times, as opposed to about 1 or 1.5 for some of these rivers. And so all the action is really compressed in a small period of time. And that also deals with the seasonality at the coast. And how those interactions go forward, it becomes a really interesting question. As you can see, this is a picture of the Colville Delta with the sea ice. If it weren't so dark, you'd be able to see a sediment plume going into that coastal boundary there. And so there's a coupling of that peak time with when the sea ice goes out. And so at the coastal interface, there's some really interesting interactions to explore. So to go through a quick overview of what we've been looking at for the river floodplain component of it. This component, I'll present some research that we did from remote sensing analysis. We've done a bunch of field work, but I'm going to only really show the Pan-Arctic results. And so we've done analysis of 14 segments of rivers across the Arctic using Landsat data, high resolution data. And what we measure is the change along the river banks over time. And all told, we've done about 5,000 and a half kilometers of river. And we have a measurement of erosion for each pixel in the image we have. So we have almost 1.6 million measurements of erosion. What we do is we bin that, and then we look at the system characteristics of the erosion and take a look at it. And we've ranged it from the smallest rivers of the Siluric River, about just under 2,000 square kilometers, to the largest, the Lena. And so we've tried to get a wide range of geographic boundaries, permafrost, whatever else, to assess it. And one of our key questions in motivating this originally was, how are Arctic rivers different, and in what ways are they different from non-Arctic rivers in permafrost? And so since we haven't been able to upscale our analysis and do that type of analysis globally, we did a metadata search and compiled data from all the published literature as of probably middle of last year or the fall, where we compiled it. And so this is what we're using to compare the Arctic rivers against. But an interesting component of this, if you're looking at sort of river to land to ocean feedback, is some of the biases in our data sets of understanding what river dynamics are across the globe. And so you have heavily sampling in North America, in Northern Europe, particularly England. Increasingly, you're getting some in South America, in the Southern Asia from remote sensing. There's a huge gap in Africa, and there's a huge gap in the Arctic prior to our work. There were only 13 published studies with about 26 rates for what Arctic river erosion was doing, what floodplain interaction was. So the punchline of that work is, really you can look in the middle, the green is our data, and the blue and red are just the published data stratified in different ways. And because the published data had a whole range of methodologies, how people were measuring erosion rates, we lumped them all together, and then we split them out to the ways that were most equal to the way we measured it. But these are the mean values with the standard error. And no matter how you slice it, the Arctic rivers are slower than non-Arctic rivers by about a factor of 5. And this is normalized because as bigger rivers erode faster than smaller rivers, so to try to control for that natural phenomenon, we normalize by the width of the river, which is proportional to its drainage area generally. And what we see is that they are slower. And in this talk, I won't get into all the background reasons, but we've investigated that in terms of the hydrology, the sediment loads, the erosion potential, sort of the timing of the water. And basically we come away with that it is permafrost. It is the sort of single best explanation for why it is. And the simple explanation for that is if you have a riverbank that before you can physically remove the sediment and entrain it in the river, you have to thaw it. That's an extra amount of time. It actually sets an upper limit to how quickly these rivers can erode. And if you plot this up by drainage size, you start to see it's more prevalent at the larger rivers. And so the influence is stronger on the larger rivers, and on the smaller rivers, they're much closer to their temperate counterparts, but they're highly controlled by the topology. So the next step that we wanted to do was to take these erosion rates and be able to say something in terms of Pan-Arctic about what the fluxes of sediment and carbon that might be coming from riverbank floodplain erosion to the ocean would be. And so we developed methodologies for taking our river measurements, so this is a section of the Yukon, and collecting the drainage basin above it, and then extracting a range of possible controls on erosion that we see, both local and watershed scale. And so in terms of the topography, the precipitation, the river slope, a whole host of both modeled and observed data sets over the time period of erosion in order to try to begin to develop an empirical model. And so this is the first cut of trying to assemble all that data. So these are binned in different sections, and those bins give it. And so with looking at the simplest model that we could, river discharge, river slope and the mean annual air temperature are the strongest positive controls on riverbank erosion. And then as a river is less flashy, the erosion rates go down. We clearly need to revisit the model and try to see whether we can resolve some of this bias, but as a first cut, this gives us a pretty good approach to upscaling our measurements and applying that across the Arctic. And so to do that, to couple that to get the soil erosion, we wanted to look at soil organic carbon, so we take that map that Lee had, and we also identify the sections of the river prone to alluvial erosion, and we upscale it, and this is a conservative first cut estimate. It was our attempt to say, is this even important at the scale of carbon export that we're seeing in these rivers? And so we just assign a common carbon content, and we just say it's in the upper 3 meters, even though most of these rivers are 10, 15 meters deep. And so it's a conservative estimate just to say what are the magnitudes. And what we see is we just take the 10 major rivers and we sum up the carbon flux. We get about 6.4 teragrams of carbon per year, which if you remember from Maria's talk yesterday, coastal erosion is about 46 teragrams per year is the estimate, and then from the Great Rivers Observatory scaling up DOC, the estimate is about 34, POC is about 6. This is the sort of measured river fluxes. And so what we're seeing is the riverbank erosion is putting in amounts of carbon which are on the same order of particulate organic carbon in a significant fraction of the dissolved organic carbon, suggesting that if you want to know what's coming out at the end of the river, and you want to know its quality and content and age, understanding the dynamics of the river is going to be an important component to understand what's arriving at the coast. So the next component is really work that postdoc, who's now becoming staff at Los Alamos, Anastasia Piliouras, has been working on, which is looking at the delta component. And she had a number of specific questions, which is without being able to go out and make measurements, depending on the DOE project we're working on, we have different constraints, and this one doesn't really have any money for observation. So we're using remote sensing and some modeling to look at it and say, well, what do we have, what do we see going on, and what can we say about how Arctic deltas might be operating? And so Anastasia's done a lot of remote sensing work. These are maps of the channel networks on 2 of the deltas, the Lena and the Mackenzie, and the color coding is by width, and then the dots are the outlets, and they're scaled by the size of the channel feeding them. And what she was looking at here was, can we say anything about how deltas distribute material at the coast? With the idea, if we were going to couple it to an ocean model, do we need to know where all the channels are, or can we use what is currently used, at least in the DOE model, of just dumping it as a point source? And what she found is there was variability in a lot of the deltas, even though you may have a large spread, they tended to come out at 1 or 2 points, whereas if there was less spread, they tended to come out at 1 point. And so, at least for a first cut, simple, depending on the resolution of your model, if you have a coarse model, using a point source probably isn't that bad. If you wanted to look at very close coastal dynamics, what she has been finding working with some people at Rutgers ocean models is that if you put material here and you put material here, they have very different trajectories in the ocean, they have different mixing. And so that becomes important to know, depending on the scale of question you want, what's coming out the different components and at what time of year. Another component she's been looking at is the ability for the deltas to capture material coming through them. And so she's been looking at the lakes, the lake distributions, and the connectivity of the lakes to try to understand how large a sponge are the deltas in terms of where they go. And that varies quite a bit across the deltas, and we're still exploring what is the control and how would that operate going forward. And this is the Colville, and this is the Colima, I believe. Those labels disappeared on the slide. And so another question that she's really been exploring is, what is the role of ice in permafrost? We have a high variability in permafrost extent on the deltas, and this is a beautiful picture from the Lena River just at ice breakup. And you can still see the ice in the channel in some of these cases, and some of the channels are opening up, some are still covered, and you can see as the water goes on the ice and the open ice leads. And so once again, there's a very strong dynamic between when there's ice plugging the channels and when the river flow comes out. And so to explore this without making observation, she was working with Rebecca Lausen, who just finished her PhD at Duke last year, and they were using a very simple reduced complexity model of a delta that gives an idealized situation. And they put in some simple rules for permafrost affecting the erodibility and for ice. And these are sort of the range of delta morphologies as you change the erodibility, and they see a similar thing with the ice. And what they find is that the structure and channel networks of the deltas vary significantly depending on how the ice and permafrost affect it. And the takeaway from that work is that ice and permafrost limit the channel mobility. And so as they warm and you lose permafrost, you may have greater mobility on the deltas, you may have recycling material stored in the deltas and deliver it. And the ice and permafrost change the way sediment is past the offshore region versus stored onshore. That the ice and blocks the channels, you tend to have more deposition within the delta as it dams it up, and so you have more storage internally on the delta versus it being routed offshore. And so you may have a change in the way material routes through the delta and is delivered to the nearshore region as you change the ice dynamics on deltas. So for the sort of the second half of it, I'm going to go through an overview of some Arctic projects that are funded by DOE and discuss some modeling gaps that are really sort of DOE model-centric, and they're also somewhat focused on the topics we are particularly interested in right now. There's other people in the audience that I'm sure would have different opinions, and it depends on what question you're trying to ask, but it's really sort of a high level to go through it. And so some of the major Arctic issues that DOE is funding is the HILAT-RASM project, which is what funded the Delta work that Anastasia has been working on. It is a program that's joint Los Alamos, PNL, and through the RASM component, which is the Regional Arctic System Model, which is run for the Naval Postgraduate School, Wisław Wyslowski, and then Bart Nielsen at University of Washington, et cetera. And they're focused on sort of large scale, there's multiple components of it, but large scale atmospheric ocean interactions. There's some biogeochemistry components, particularly looking at the river delta connections between the rivers, and then some uncertainty as well, and other ocean modeling questions. Another big project which I've been involved in, which is a terrestrial project, is the Next Generation Ecosystem Experiment, Arctic, which is really focused on ecosystem dynamics and landscape change across the Arctic, looking at carbon cycling and vegetation change. And a lot of work's been done at the Barrow Environmental Observatory and now on the Seward Peninsula, and that's really more on the land-based side. We're entering our third and final phase on that project. Our hope is really to be able to take our plot scale watershed, very small watershed scale, and begin to understand how to scale it up, to understand how a changing terrestrial Arctic might affect fluxes. There's the DOE Global Climate Model, which is the E3SM. A big component of that model, which is somewhat different than some of the other global models, is the ocean model has a variable resolution grid, so we're able to refine resolution in coastal regions and also in other areas where we want to, and still run it in a global model context. And so that's a tool that we're beginning to explore both with some internal projects at LANL and with funded projects at DOE to understand coastal dynamics and begin to try to look at some coastal processes when it. This next project is, I'll talk a little bit more, it's a new proposal that we have in right now, which is really focused at the coast. And our goal is linking land and ocean and being able to take modeling capabilities and moving it forward. Two other relevant aspects are model benchmarking, which is supported through DOE, which is traditionally the land model, but they're also developing an ocean model benchmarking tool. And it's a way to ingest data sets and have standard metrics and be able to test models and do intermodal comparisons. And that's an effort that, if you're not familiar with, could be very useful for the community in looking for engagement. And so a quick overview of the interface project, which is under review, and if we successfully review at the end of July, it would have an FY19 start. And a couple of the key aspects we really would like to explore is the seasonality. And one unique aspect about this project is, unlike a lot of the other DOE projects where we're looking for global climate feedbacks, this is really trying to look at human climate interactions. And so there's a big component of it, of how a changing Arctic will interact with human dynamics and human systems. And so our main research areas that we've highlighted are permafrost hydrology and how it affects fluxes to the ocean. We're looking at sea ice and incorporating land-fast ice dynamics into the global sea ice model so they begin to explore the coastal interactions. The marine biogeochemistry, a real focus is analyzing what controls it and how different aspects will affect marine biogeochemistry, but adding in a model gap is adding in the ability to look at benthic biogeochemistry. Coastal change, we're beginning to try to explore, can we begin to parameterize what fluxes from coastal erosion would be, but also the effect of sea level rise and flooding on permafrost thaw are areas. And then the resources, transportation, and settlements are the human component side we would begin to explore. At least in the initial part of the project, we'd have a strong focus on the North Slope of Alaska with the goal to be able to look pan-Arctic with global connections. And so now, a very quick sort of review of modeling gaps. On the river and coast side, one key aspect that we really need to be able to do to look at what's going on in the coastal ocean is have accurate and dynamic river fluxes. And So right now, a key aspect is in the global or system model, at least DOE, there's really been very little testing of how well it predicts Arctic rivers, particularly in terms of the timing and seasonality of the fluxes. There is heat as well, but that has not been tested. So one of the key necessary things is understand how the current models are doing. New components will be able to get sediments and nutrients into the model. There are initial components within the DOE model to have sediment, but it's really not been developed for Arctic systems. And so from the Arctic, that's a key area that we'd be looking at and kind of tie to the work that NG Arctic has been doing. Looking at seasonality is a key, and then the dynamics and what controls those fluxes of the coastal ocean. On the ocean side, key modeling gaps that we would like to address in the interface project is being able to do the land-fast ice and having the high enough resolution at the coast. Getting better vertical mixing is a key limitation in the Arctic right now. The vertical mixing parameterizations are really drawn from non-Arctic regions, and that limits the ability to understand cycling, overturning, heat loss, and dynamics within it. And then getting in waves and tides to understand shelf dynamics, interactions with sea ice is another critical need to really model the Arctic, particularly at it. In the biogeochemistry, as I mentioned, getting a much better coupling to rivers and fluxes from rivers is key to understanding the Arctic dynamics. I borrowed this from the Arctic Colors because it was a really nice diagram. Also being able to look at the fluxes from coastal erosion. Then within the marine biogeochemistry, as we said, benthic is currently missing the DOE models. Sediment is absent, and really if we want to look at things like light availability and the sediment and nutrient fluxes, that's going to be key to being able to address it. One of the key issues of any of it is being able to couple the models and how you couple it. It's a very critical aspect in the global climate models. At Los Alamos, we've been exploring being able to do wetting and drying and having dynamic interface, but that's still really just in the beginning of how we address that. And how do you have accurate feedbacks between the system, and if you do have a changing coastline, how you deal with that. And so those are all areas that in the modeling framework that really are challenges that we've been trying to address, particularly at Los Alamos, but within DOE in general. So finally, acknowledgements are, a lot of the work I presented today comes out from the Subsurface and Biological Research Program. That was funding a lot of the floodplain river research I had. And then the highlight is funded out of the Regional and Global Climate Model Analysis. And there's here's a host of key collaborators on a lot of the river and floodplain aspect in the delta modeling. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Joel. Any questions for Joel? Yes.
Thanks for your talk. Oh, I'm Julia Moriarty. I'm at USGS. And I was curious how, and you're going about, if you could speak more about the benchmarking efforts that you're
Sure.
doing and model evaluation and how you're thinking about that.
So I have not interacted a whole lot with the ILAM project up until now, and so as part of the interface project, one of our key goals is to bring in the ability to benchmark the river fluxes, because right now they just benchmark runoff at a cell in the current case. And so we'd really like to be able to bring in hydrographs and pull out information in the data to look at much more precise seasonality, time statistics of when peak flow is, the magnitude of peak flow, those aspects of it. As a whole, if you go to the ILAM website, there's a whole suite of benchmarking things, particularly related to land models. You can look at NPP, you can look at ground surface temperature, and they have metrics for skill, both sort of at a point and more broadly regionally. And so they writing scripts and trying to make it very simple to do output and reading in data sets. You can do it both at a global scale, and you can also do it in a regionally specific area.
Any other questions for Joel?
I have a question for you,
Sure.
Joel. So you mentioned you're using remote sensing data sets for the validation of some of these model output and some of the other work you're doing. What are the most important satellite data sets you're using, and have you tried to incorporate satellite observations of carbon as well, DOC or POC, chlorophyll, and some of these?
No, we haven't gotten that sophisticated. I have to say we're pretty limited. I mean, a lot of the remote sensing I've done, I've pretty much self-taught. So it was visual imagery, and we're just doing a lot of change detection. We'd love to be able to move forward, as I was talking to you the other day, particularly for the ice aspects and the deltas, using radar data or other aspects that aren't so cloud dependent. where we can actually really look at the wet dry. Because right now, for the deltas, we have great mass, so we know where the channels are. And so if we could look at when the timing of the change from ice to water, and then look at how it times the ice out, that would be great. But for the coastal mixing and other dynamics, we would love to be able to bring in other measures that would get us sediment and carbon and CDOM and those types. We just don't have the expertise, and we really haven't had the scope to explore it. And so that's an area where a collaboration would be wonderful, because those are the type of things we'd love to be able to predict and assess how it's changing through time. But really, within the team we have, and also within DOE largely, that's not an area that there's a lot of expertise or knowledge on.
Right. So here is the right audience, I guess, for this, because there are many people here who work with the satellite data sets and retrievals of organic matter, DOC, POC, chlorophyll, and some of these data sets could be integrated.
No, that would be
with some
great.
of
I mean,
your-
that would help us tremendously, because right now we're kind of just, if we get the models up and running, I mean, it's
Right.
like, it looks good.
Yes, yes. Any other questions for Joel?
Hey, thank you for the great talk. I'm Charlotte Wagner from Harvard University. I've got a question about the relative magnitude of the DOC that may get mobilized through the melting of permafrost that will actually reach the open ocean. You indicated that a lot of it is getting washed out of the delta and being retained less. But then there is still the question of how much actually gets transported out into the open ocean. Do you have an idea of what that would be across the
No, I
ocean?
don't. I mean, that's one of the key questions that we're looking at for sort of the river floodplain aspect, which is the best we can do is based off soil carbon estimates, what's going into the river. Last summer we did do some field work on the Koyukuk River, where we were trying to look at both carbon content in the eroding banks and the deposit and try to understand what the relative flux is. But we don't know in terms of, at least from the bank erosion, how much is being evolved from the river. I think there's very limited data, and Tom or someone else might have better knowledge of it, of whether people even have tried to do much research on the outgassing from the rivers to understand how much is even making it through the system. And so right now, I mean, there's also the question of how much is coming off from the runoff. There's a lot of dissolved material coming out of thawing permafrost, and the question is that people have measured offshore the age of the carbon that you see coming out of the deltas or in the near shore. And I think it's an open question of whether that's a signature of thawing permafrost, or whether or not things like the river bank exchange, which is eroding really old carbon, is actually what's there, because we don't have good records of what the age of the carbon was 30 years ago. And so the assumption that if we see old carbon coming out now, it means permafrost is thawing, I think is somewhat flawed, because there may be systems that recycle old carbon. That's always been the case. And so it's hard to interpret sort of what the fate of the carbon is and where it's coming from by just looking at its age or composition at the end, because there's many different pathways the carbon, both dissolved and particulate, could be getting into the system. And that's, I think, a critical gap in our understanding of how the system's changing and what, when we go and make a measurement, what it actually means about happening upstream.
Hi, Luke Carberry, first-year grad student at UCSB. I'm wondering if you're able to make measurements of, let's say, carbon flux in one river in the Arctic. Is that generalizable to the Russian rivers, or are there inherent differences between the American Arctic and then, or the North American Arctic and the Russian?
Well, it depends on what aspect you're trying to look at. So for the erosion rates, we were trying to do a large enough to understand which physically controlling. I think for the constituents, it's going to be very different. If you remember Lee's map, the carbon map you look at in Siberia, you have some massive peat zones. You also have Yedema deposits, which are very old and are really carbon rich and also ice rich, whereas if you look at our erosion rates and you look at the size of the floodplains, just taking a simple mass balance of the carbon coming across it, the floodplain itself, almost all of them are Holocene, and not many of them would be more than about 2,000 or 5,000 years old. But these rivers also transect areas that are much older and have very different carbon content. And so I think you're going to have distinct signatures depending on where in the Arctic you're looking at. And the permafrost distribution also will affect the relative groundwater, surface water contributions in aspects like that. So I don't think One of the key questions we'd like to look at is how much the scale depends. The small rivers behave very differently than the big rivers, and I think a lot of the signature that you might see that shows you that variability and will control it gets washed out when we're just looking at the major rivers, that you've kind of lost the signature by the time you're looking at the end point of something like the Lena River. And so to understand what's controlling that variability, I think you need to step up and begin to look at the smaller system where you can actually make attributions.
Any more questions for Joel?